The year was 60 CE, and the screams echoing from the courtyard of an Iceni royal residence would haunt Britain for generations. What began as a simple succession dispute had transformed into something far more sinister, as Roman officials demonstrated exactly how they dealt with queens who dared question imperial authority. The woman being publicly flogged was not some common criminal or rebellious slave. She was Boudica, queen of the Iceni, and her punishment was about to ignite one of the most devastating rebellions in Roman history. But this was no isolated incident of Roman cruelty. What we're about to uncover represents a systematic approach to breaking captured royalty that went far beyond simple execution. The Romans had perfected something far more calculated, far more psychologically devastating than a quick death. They had created an entire machinery of humiliation, designed specifically to destroy not just the body, but the very essence of what made a ruler powerful. Today we're diving deep into the darkest corners of Roman conquest, where queens who once commanded armies and ruled vast territories found themselves subjected to horrors that would make seasoned warriors weep. These aren't the sanitized stories you learned in school. These are the brutal realities that ancient historians recorded in their most private writings, accounts so disturbing that many were deliberately buried for centuries. The truth is, when Rome conquered a kingdom, they weren't just claiming territory, they were orchestrating theatre, deadly methodical theatre where captured queens served as the star performers in spectacles designed to terrorize entire civilizations into submission. What happened to these women was so calculated, so precisely engineered to maximize suffering and humiliation that it reveals something truly chilling about how power operated in the ancient world. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're a queen who has ruled for decades, commanding respect from nobles and citizens alike. Your word determines life and death. Your presence strikes fear into enemies and inspires loyalty in subjects. Then, in a single battle, everything changes. Suddenly, you're not a ruler anymore. According to Roman law, you're not even a person. You've become property, and the legal protections that once shielded you from harm have evaporated like morning mist. This transformation wasn't accidental. Roman legal scholars had crafted a framework specifically designed to strip defeated rulers of every protection afforded to human beings. The principle they called ius gentium, or the law of nations, held that military defeat fundamentally altered a person's very existence. Victory didn't just change political boundaries, it changed the legal reality of everyone within those boundaries, transforming free people into slaves with the stroke of a sword. Under this system, a queen commanded no more legal standing than the lowest foot soldier in her defeated army. The crown that had once symbolized divine authority became meaningless decoration on a piece of human property. Roman citizens possessed rights that protected them from certain punishments, but foreign captives, regardless of their former status or royal blood, held no such protections. They could be mistreated, displayed, sold, or killed entirely at the discretion of their captors. But here's where the Roman approach became truly diabolical. They didn't simply execute captured queens. Death, after all, was final. It ended the story, closed the book, and allowed martyrdom to take root. Instead, the Romans discovered something far more effective. They learned that a broken queen, publicly humiliated and stripped of dignity, served as a far more powerful warning than a dead one. The process began the moment capture occurred. Roman commanders understood that the psychological impact of defeat could be amplified through careful staging. A queen might be kept in relative comfort initially, allowed to believe that negotiation remained possible. This false hope served a purpose. When the true horror began, the contrast would be all the more devastating. Transportation to Rome became the first act in an elaborate drama of degradation. The journey wasn't simply about moving prisoners from one location to another. It was about systematically dismantling everything that had once made these women powerful. They were paraded through conquered territories, their presence serving as living proof that resistance was futile. The Romans had studied human psychology with the precision of military engineers. They understood that dignity, once stripped away publicly, could never be fully restored. They knew that witnesses to humiliation carried the story far beyond the immediate audience, spreading fear like a plague through potential enemies. Most importantly, they recognized that the fate of queens resonated differently than the fate of kings. In ancient societies where women already occupied precarious positions of power, the message was unmistakable. If even queens could be reduced to objects of entertainment, what hope did ordinary people have? This brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of Roman conquest, the triumph. These weren't simple victory parades, but carefully choreographed spectacles that transformed human suffering into public entertainment. When a Roman general received permission from the Senate to celebrate a triumph, preparations began for a display that would demonstrate Rome's dominance through the streets of the capital for all to witness. The route stretched nearly 4 kilometers through the heart of Rome, winding from the Campus Martius through the Forum and up to the Capitoline Hill. Every step was calculated for maximum psychological impact. The procession followed a specific order designed to build anticipation and terror in equal measure. Musicians and entertainers led the parade, creating a festival atmosphere that drew massive crowds. Behind them came carts bearing paintings and models of conquered cities, offering Romans a glimpse of distant lands their legions had subdued. Wild animals from exotic territories were displayed in chains, symbols of the unknown worlds now under Roman control. But the real centerpiece of any triumph was the prisoners of war. These weren't anonymous captives shuffling in defeat. They were the former rulers of great kingdoms, walking in shackles at the heart of the spectacle. Captured queens marched at the front of the prisoner column, their royal garments often left intact to emphasize the magnitude of their fall. Imagine the psychological torture of this moment. Women who had once inspired fear and respect in equal measure now shuffled through hostile streets while crowds jeered and celebrated their humiliation. The contrast was absolutely deliberate. By displaying monarchs in their full regalia while bound and powerless, Rome communicated a message that resonated far beyond the city walls. The journey typically consumed an entire day, with the procession moving slowly to allow spectators along the route to observe every detail of the defeated ruler's degradation. For captured queens, this meant enduring the gaze of thousands while stripped of all dignity and power. They walked this gauntlet, knowing their fate hung in the balance, with some destined to survive the day, while others would not see sunset. The uncertainty itself served as exquisite torture. Every step through streets lined with celebrating Romans forced the defeated to contemplate their approaching doom. Would they join the rare few granted clemency, or would they follow the grim tradition that awaited most captive rulers at the procession's end? This is where our story takes an even darker turn, because what happened to these queens after the crowds dispersed reveals the true genius of Roman psychological warfare. The empire had discovered that the threat of unknown horrors often proved more effective than known punishments. By keeping captive royalty alive but powerless, they created living symbols that haunted the dreams of potential enemies across the known world. But before we explore the specific fates that awaited these women, we need to understand exactly how Roman law had stripped them of every protection that might have saved them from the horrors to come. Roman legal doctrine had created something unprecedented in the ancient world, a systematic framework for the complete dehumanization of defeated royalty. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code dating back to the 5th century BCE, had established these principles with brutal clarity. War captives became property of the Roman state, distributed among soldiers like any other spoils of conquest. But the true horror lay in what this legal transformation meant for women who had once wielded absolute power. When a queen fell into Roman hands, she discovered that her former authority meant absolutely nothing once chains replaced her crown. The legal machinery that had once protected her subjects now worked against her with terrifying efficiency. Roman officials showed no hesitation in violating those who had once commanded armies and administered justice. The law that had once bent to accommodate royal privilege now crushed it without mercy. This legal vulnerability created opportunities for cruelty that went far beyond what even hardened soldiers might have imagined. Female captives faced additional dangers that their male counterparts could never fully comprehend. Roman military culture, forged through centuries of conquest, regarded captured women as legitimate spoils of war. While some elite prisoners might be housed in relative comfort pending ransom negotiations, most faced immediate and systematic degradation. The line between prisoner of war and slave existed only in theoretical discussions among legal scholars. In practice, defeat dissolved all former status, leaving captive queens vulnerable to treatment that would have sparked outrage had they possessed Roman citizenship. This wasn't accidental oversight in Roman law. It was deliberate policy, carefully crafted to ensure that resistance carried consequences so severe that entire civilizations would think twice before challenging imperial authority. Consider the psychological warfare embedded in this system. A queen who had spent decades making life and death decisions suddenly found herself with no legal standing whatsoever. Every comfort she had known, every protection she had taken for granted, every assumption about basic human dignity simply vanished. The Romans understood that this radical transformation of status often proved more devastating than physical torture, but physical torture was certainly part of the equation. The case of Queen Boudica reveals exactly how far Roman officials were willing to go in their systematic destruction of royal dignity. When her husband King Prasutagus died, leaving a will that attempted to protect his family through compromise, Roman procurators, led by Decianus Cartus, ignored the legal document entirely. They seized Iceni lands and declared the entire kingdom forfeit. What followed demonstrated the calculated nature of Roman cruelty toward defeated queens. Boudica was publicly flogged, a punishment that represented profound legal and social violation. To flog a Roman citizen required extensive legal justification and procedural safeguards. To beat a queen of an allied kingdom constituted deliberate humiliation designed to break both ruler and subjects. The flogging itself was merely the beginning. Roman soldiers violated Boudica's daughters, likely teenagers who had never known anything but royal protection. These assaults weren't random acts of violence committed by undisciplined troops. They represented calculated degradation performed before the Iceni people, designed to terrorize an entire population into submission through the systematic destruction of their royal family. The public nature of these crimes multiplied their psychological impact exponentially. This wasn't violence committed in secret, but humiliation performed as theatre. By abusing the royal family in front of their subjects, Roman officials communicated a message about the fate awaiting those who questioned imperial authority. The physical violation of Boudica and her daughters was meant to shatter the very concept of royal inviolability. The strategy backfired catastrophically. Rather than crushing resistance, the abuse ignited a rebellion that nearly drove Rome from Britain entirely. Boudica raised an army that destroyed 3 Roman cities, massacring tens of thousands of Roman citizens and their allies. The queen herself became a symbol of vengeance, fighting not for political advantage, but to avenge the violated honor of her family. Yet even successful rebellion couldn't erase what had been done. The systematic humiliation of royal women served its purpose regardless of immediate political consequences. Stories of Boudica's treatment spread throughout the Roman world, carrying with them a chilling message about what awaited queens who dared resist imperial expansion. This brings us to perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Roman psychological warfare, the triumph ceremony itself. These elaborate spectacles transformed conquered royalty into entertainment. But they did so through careful manipulation of visual symbolism and crowd psychology. When Queen Zenobia of Palmyra was finally captured, after carving out an empire that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia, Emperor Aurelian acquired more than just a military victory. He had captured the perfect symbol for his upcoming triumph, a queen whose very presence would communicate Rome's dominance over the wealthiest kingdoms of the East. The preparations for Zenobia's appearance in the triumphal procession reveal the calculated psychology behind these spectacles. She wasn't simply chained and marched through the streets. Instead, Roman craftsmen created heavy golden chains specifically for the occasion, so massive that guards marched beside her to help bear their weight. The choice of gold was absolutely deliberate. These chains symbolized the very wealth Zenobia had commanded, now turned into the instrument of her bondage. Her entire person became a walking display of conquered riches, every step a reminder that even the mightiest queens could be reduced to Roman property. But here's where Roman psychology became truly sophisticated. Ancient sources note that Zenobia maintained remarkable composure throughout the ordeal, carrying herself with dignity despite the weight of the chains and hours of slow marching through hostile crowds. This very defiance may have saved her life, as Aurelian calculated that her continued existence served his purposes better than her death. The emperor granted Zenobia a villa near Rome, where she lived out her remaining years as a living monument to Roman power. Some accounts claim she married a Roman senator and became part of aristocratic society, her daughters eventually marrying into noble families. Whether this represented mercy or a more subtle form of ongoing humiliation remains debated by historians. What's certain is that Zenobia spent her final decades as a constant reminder of Rome's ability to transform even the most powerful queens into Roman dependents. Her presence in Italian society served as living proof that resistance ultimately led not to glorious death, but to comfortable captivity that somehow felt worse than execution. The psychological sophistication of this approach cannot be overstated. Dead queens could become martyrs, inspiring future generations to resist Roman expansion. Living queens, reduced to Roman pensioners, served as walking advertisements for the futility of resistance. They proved that even victory in defeat was impossible, that Rome's reach extended beyond the grave into the very identity of those who challenged imperial authority. This systematic approach to breaking captured royalty extended far beyond individual cases. Roman officials had created an entire methodology for destroying the psychological foundations of resistance before it could take root. The methodology behind Roman brutality toward captured queens reveals something even more chilling than individual acts of cruelty. Roman strategists had identified a fundamental truth about human psychology. The complete destruction of identity proves more devastating than the destruction of the body. They understood that a queen's power rested not just on military might or political alliances, but on an intangible quality that ancient peoples called dignitas. This concept encompassed honor, respect, and the psychological authority that made subjects willingly obey their rulers. Roman conquest aimed to shatter this dignitas so completely that rebuilding it became impossible. They accomplished this through a process that modern psychologists would recognize as systematic identity destruction. The transformation began with legal redefinition, continued through public humiliation, and culminated in forced dependency that lasted for decades. But the most insidious aspect of this system was its unpredictability. Some captive queens faced immediate execution. Others endured years of comfortable captivity. Still others disappeared entirely from historical records, their fates deliberately obscured to maximize the fear of unknown possibilities. This uncertainty created a psychological weapon more powerful than any sword or siege engine. Consider the case of Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, who discovered that even collaboration with Rome offered no protection from imperial cruelty. Initially, She had allied herself with Roman forces, believing that cooperation would preserve her kingdom's independence. When civil war erupted among her people, she made the fateful decision to hand over the British resistance leader Caratacus to Roman authorities. The betrayal earned her temporary Roman protection, but it also demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining dignity while serving imperial interests. Cartimandua found herself trapped between subjects who viewed her as a traitor and Roman allies who regarded her as a useful tool rather than a legitimate ruler. When her own nobles finally rebelled against her Roman collaboration, she discovered that imperial protection came with a price that stripped away everything that had once made her powerful. Roman records describe her final years as a pensioner in Roman territory, neither prisoner nor citizen, existing in a legal limbo that prevented her from ever reclaiming authority. She had avoided the dramatic humiliation of a triumphal procession, but in exchange had accepted a slower, more complete erasure of her identity as a queen. Her story spread throughout Britain as a warning about the ultimate fate of those who trusted Roman promises. The Romans had learned that different forms of destruction worked more effectively on different personalities. Proud queens who maintained their defiance faced public spectacles designed to break their spirit through humiliation. Pragmatic queens who sought accommodation discovered that collaboration led to a different kind of destruction, one that ate away at their legitimacy from within, until nothing remained but an empty title attached to a powerless figurehead. This brings us to the most disturbing aspect of Roman methodology: the deliberate cultivation of hopelessness. Roman officials had studied the psychology of resistance and identified hope as the greatest threat to imperial stability. A people who believed their situation might improve would continue fighting. A people convinced that resistance was futile would submit without requiring constant military pressure. Captured queens served as perfect instruments for destroying hope, because their fates demonstrated that even the most powerful women could be reduced to Roman playthings. But the Romans went further, creating elaborate systems to ensure that these lessons reached the widest possible audience. The triumph ceremony itself was broadcast throughout the empire through detailed written accounts, artistic depictions, and eyewitness testimony from provincial officials who traveled to Rome for the spectacle. These reports weren't simple news dispatches, but carefully crafted propaganda designed to communicate specific messages about Roman power and the futility of resistance. Provincial governors received instructions to ensure that accounts of triumphal processions reached local populations, particularly focusing on the treatment of captured royalty. The descriptions emphasized not just the fact of defeat, but the specific methods used to humiliate former rulers. Local populations learned exactly what awaited their own leaders, if they chose the path of rebellion. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Roman strategy was the way they manipulated time itself as a weapon against captive queens. Death, however brutal, offered finality. The Romans discovered that prolonged uncertainty created far more effective terror. Some captive queens spent years in comfortable Roman villas, never knowing whether they would wake up to continued luxury or sudden execution. Others faced decades of public appearances at Roman festivals, their presence serving as entertainment for crowds who viewed them as exotic curiosities rather than former rulers. The uncertainty about their ultimate fate became a form of torture that affected not just the captives themselves, but everyone who heard their stories. This temporal manipulation extended to the treatment of royal children. Roman officials understood that the fate of a queen's offspring could be used as leverage for decades after initial conquest. Children of defeated royalty might be raised in Roman households, educated in Roman customs, and gradually transformed into symbols of successful imperial assimilation. Alternatively, they might be held as hostages, their safety dependent on their mother's continued cooperation with Roman authorities. The threat to royal children created a psychological prison that proved more effective than any physical restraint. A queen might accept personal humiliation, But the knowledge that her children's lives hung in the balance forced cooperation that went far beyond what physical torture could achieve. Roman officials exploited this maternal vulnerability with calculated precision, using it to ensure compliance for years or even decades after initial conquest. This systematic approach to psychological warfare extended into every aspect of how Romans treated captured royalty. Even basic human needs became opportunities for humiliation. Food, clothing, and shelter were provided or withheld based on the captive's willingness to participate in their own degradation. A queen who maintained her dignity might find herself eating scraps, while one who embraced her new status as Roman property enjoyed elaborate meals. The clothing provided to captive queens served particular symbolic purposes. Some were dressed in their original royal regalia, but modified to emphasize their powerlessness. Crowns might be welded shut so they couldn't be removed, transforming symbols of authority into permanent reminders of defeat. Royal robes might be altered to include chains or other restraints, creating garments that simultaneously displayed former status and current subjugation. Other captives found themselves dressed in Roman clothing that emphasized their transformation from foreign queens into imperial dependents. These costume changes weren't simply practical decisions but calculated psychological attacks designed to erode the captive's sense of identity. Every time a former queen looked at her reflection, she saw evidence of her complete transformation from ruler to Roman property. The Romans also manipulated social relationships as weapons against captive royalty. Former queens might be forced to serve Roman nobles at public dinners, their presence providing entertainment for guests who could observe firsthand how completely imperial conquest had reversed traditional power relationships. These social humiliations were carefully staged to maximize psychological impact, while maintaining plausible deniability about their deliberately cruel nature. Roman hosts could claim they were simply including their foreign guests in Roman social customs, but everyone present understood the true purpose of these gatherings. They served as living theatre, where the audience could witness the complete transformation of former enemies into docile imperial subjects. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate participants, as accounts of these social reversals spread throughout Roman society and beyond. The treatment of captured queens also served important domestic political purposes within Roman society itself. Citizens who witnessed the humiliation of foreign royalty received powerful messages about the benefits of Roman citizenship and the terrible fate awaiting those who challenged imperial authority. These spectacles reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating that even the most exalted foreign nobles ranked below ordinary Roman citizens in the imperial system. But the most chilling aspect of Roman methodology was its efficiency. The empire had created a systematic process for breaking human spirits that could be applied consistently across different cultures and circumstances. Roman officials didn't need to improvise methods of psychological destruction because they had access to centuries of accumulated knowledge about what worked most effectively against different types of resistance. This institutional knowledge meant that each new conquest built upon previous experience, creating an ever more sophisticated machinery of psychological warfare. The Romans had transformed cruelty from an art into a science, with documented procedures and proven techniques that could be deployed anywhere in the empire. The legacy of this systematic approach to destroying captive royalty extended far beyond its immediate victims. The knowledge that such fates awaited defeated rulers influenced political decisions throughout the ancient world, as potential rebels weighed the costs of resistance against the certainty of Roman retaliation. The stories that emerged from Roman dungeons carried a weight that transcended mere historical record. They became whispered warnings passed between kingdoms, cautionary tales that shaped the decisions of rulers across continents. When a queen contemplated resistance against Roman expansion, she didn't just consider military odds or political alliances. She weighed her choice against the documented fates of women who had walked that path before her. The Romans understood this psychological ripple effect with remarkable sophistication. They deliberately preserved and disseminated accounts of their treatment of captive royalty, ensuring that these stories reached the courts of potential enemies. Roman historians weren't simply recording events for posterity. They were crafting propaganda designed to prevent future rebellions before they could begin. Consider the strategic genius embedded in this approach. Every brutalized queen became a recruitment tool for Roman diplomacy. Ambassadors could reference specific cases when negotiating with foreign rulers, using documented examples of what awaited those who chose confrontation over cooperation. The threat didn't need to be stated explicitly. Everyone understood the subtext when Roman envoys mentioned previous triumphal processions or discussed the current living arrangements of formerly powerful queens. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Roman system: the way they transformed mercy itself into a weapon. When Emperor Aurelian spared Zenobia's life and granted her comfortable retirement, he wasn't displaying compassion. He was making a calculated investment in psychological warfare that would pay dividends for generations. Zenobia's survival served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. Her comfortable captivity demonstrated Roman magnanimity to those who submitted gracefully, while her permanent exile from power proved that resistance ultimately led to irreversible loss. Most importantly, her continued existence as a Roman pensioner provided a living example that could be referenced in future negotiations with rebellious kingdoms. The villa where Zenobia spent her final decades wasn't a retirement home. It was a prison constructed from comfort and social obligation. Every dinner party she attended, every Roman custom she adopted, every interaction with her new social circle reinforced the message that Roman conquest extended beyond military defeat into complete cultural transformation. But the true genius of this arrangement lay in how it corrupted the very concept of royal dignity. Zenobia could maintain the outward appearance of respect and comfort, but everyone knew she did so only through Roman generosity. Her status depended entirely on imperial whim, making her a constant advertisement for the benefits of submission over resistance. The psychological warfare didn't end with individual captives. Roman officials had developed sophisticated methods for using captured queens to destabilize entire regions long after their initial conquest. Former rulers became unwitting agents of imperial policy, their very existence serving Roman interests in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. Take the case of royal children raised in Roman households after their mother's defeat. These children grew up speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, and absorbing imperial values. When they reached adulthood, some were strategically placed in positions where they could influence their ancestral kingdoms. They weren't Roman puppets in any obvious sense, but their fundamental worldview had been shaped by decades of imperial indoctrination. These cultural hostages served as perfect examples of Roman assimilation success. They could point to their own comfort and advancement as evidence that cooperation with Rome led to prosperity rather than oppression. Their testimonies carried special weight because they came from royal bloodlines that commanded automatic respect in their ancestral territories. But the most insidious aspect of this strategy was how it corrupted traditional concepts of legitimacy. When former royal children returned to their kingdoms as Roman-educated adults, they brought with them ideas that subtly undermined local customs and power structures. They didn't need to actively promote Roman interests because their very presence demonstrated the superiority of imperial civilization. The Romans had discovered something that modern psychological warfare specialists would recognize immediately. The most effective propaganda comes from trusted sources who don't realize they're delivering propaganda. These royal children genuinely believed in Roman superiority because they had experienced it firsthand. Their advocacy for imperial values carried conviction that no amount of external pressure could have achieved. This systematic corruption of royal bloodlines created long-term strategic advantages that extended far beyond immediate military conquest. Roman officials could wait patiently for local power struggles to create opportunities for their educated royal assets to assume leadership positions. When these moments arrived, Rome gained allies who commanded traditional legitimacy while serving imperial interests. The documentation of these psychological operations reveals the extraordinary sophistication of Roman strategic thinking. Imperial archives contain detailed records of captured royal families, tracking the education and placement of children across multiple generations. Roman officials maintained relationships with royal descendants for decades, carefully nurturing connections that might prove valuable in future political crises. This institutional memory meant that Roman policy toward any particular region could draw upon accumulated knowledge spanning centuries. Officials knew which royal bloodlines commanded respect, which traditional customs could be exploited for imperial advantage, and which psychological pressure points had proven most effective against previous resistance movements. The efficiency of this system becomes even more remarkable when you consider its scale. The Roman Empire encompassed dozens of former kingdoms, each with its own royal traditions and cultural sensitivities. Yet Roman officials consistently applied psychological warfare techniques that proved effective across radically different societies and political structures. This consistency suggests something truly chilling about the imperial mindset. The Romans had reduced human psychology to a set of universal principles that could be manipulated regardless of cultural context. They had discovered that certain fears, desires, and vulnerabilities existed in all human societies, and they had developed systematic methods for exploiting these weaknesses. The treatment of captured queens provided perfect case studies for refining these techniques. Royal women represented the ultimate test subjects because they possessed maximum psychological resistance. If Roman methods could break queens who had spent lifetimes wielding absolute power, they could certainly be applied to lesser targets with even greater effectiveness. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in Roman records is how they studied the long-term psychological effects of their methods. Imperial officials tracked the mental health of captive royalty over years and decades, documenting which techniques produced lasting trauma and which allowed for eventual psychological recovery. This wasn't scientific curiosity. It was military research designed to optimize the efficiency of psychological warfare. The Romans discovered that complete psychological destruction often proved counterproductive because it created martyrs who could inspire future resistance. Instead, they developed more subtle approaches that left captives functional but permanently dependent on Roman support. These techniques produced subjects who could serve imperial interests while appearing to maintain their dignity and autonomy. The documentation reveals specific protocols for managing different types of royal prisoners. Proud queens who maintained their defiance received treatment designed to gradually erode their resistance through accumulated small humiliations. Pragmatic queens who sought accommodation faced different approaches that exploited their willingness to compromise. Emotionally fragile captives required careful handling to prevent complete psychological collapse that would eliminate their value as propaganda tools. These differentiated approaches demonstrate the sophisticated understanding Roman officials had developed about human psychology. They recognized that effective manipulation required adapting techniques to individual personalities rather than applying uniform methods to all captives. This personalized approach made their psychological warfare far more effective than crude attempts at universal intimidation. The legacy of these Roman techniques extended far beyond the ancient world. Medieval and modern governments studied Roman methods for managing conquered populations, often adapting imperial strategies to contemporary circumstances. The basic principles of psychological warfare developed by Roman officials continued to influence military and political thinking for centuries after the empire's collapse. But the most lasting impact may have been on the concept of royal dignity itself. The Roman demonstration that even the most powerful queens could be reduced to imperial dependence fundamentally altered how people thought about political authority. The divine right of kings became harder to maintain when everyone knew that divine protection had failed to save countless royal victims of Roman conquest. This erosion of traditional authority concepts created opportunities for new forms of political organization that emphasized institutional power over personal charisma. The Roman example proved that individual rulers, regardless of their personal qualities or traditional legitimacy, remained vulnerable to systematic psychological attack. This lesson influenced the development of governmental structures designed to survive the loss or corruption of particular leaders. The documentation of Roman psychological warfare also reveals something disturbing about human nature itself. The techniques that proved most effective against captured queens exploited universal vulnerabilities that exist in all human psychology. The Roman success in breaking royal resistance suggests that no individual, regardless of their background or preparation, possesses complete immunity to systematic psychological manipulation. This realization carries profound implications for understanding power relationships throughout history. The Roman Empire's longevity and expansion may have depended as much on their mastery of psychological warfare as on their military superiority. Their ability to transform conquered enemies into willing collaborators provided strategic advantages that purely military conquest could never have achieved. The systematic nature of Roman psychological operations also demonstrates how institutional knowledge can be used to amplify individual cruelty into systematic oppression. The empire had created bureaucratic structures that preserved and transmitted expertise in human manipulation across generations of officials. This institutional memory meant that Roman psychological warfare became increasingly sophisticated over time, building upon centuries of accumulated experience. The fate of captured queens under Roman rule represents more than historical curiosity. It provides insight into how power operates when legal protections collapse and institutional safeguards disappear. The transformation of royal women from absolute rulers to imperial property demonstrates the fragility of human dignity when confronted with systematic cruelty backed by overwhelming force. These lessons remain relevant because the fundamental dynamics of power and resistance haven't changed significantly since ancient times. Modern conflicts continue to feature psychological warfare techniques that would have been recognizable to Roman officials. The specific methods have evolved, but the underlying principles of systematic dehumanization and identity destruction remain disturbingly consistent across different eras and cultures. The stories we've uncovered today reveal something that goes far beyond ancient history. The systematic destruction of captured queens by Roman forces wasn't simply brutal conquest, it was the deliberate engineering of human suffering for political control. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated psychological operations that transformed the very concept of royal power across the ancient world. The women who endured these horrors became unwilling architects of a new reality where resistance seemed impossible and submission appeared as the only rational choice. Their broken spirits echoed across centuries, whispering warnings to future generations about the true cost of challenging imperial authority. Today, as we close this chapter on Rome's darkest methods, remember that understanding this history isn't about glorifying cruelty. It's about recognizing how easily human dignity can be systematically destroyed when power faces no meaningful constraints.